Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for being with me today on the Wave Capital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You're my 101st guest. How are you today, Barbara McQuade?
Oh, I'm great, Garrett. Thanks very much for having me. Honored to be with you.
It's an honor to be with you as well and talking about relationship building in a team environment, what relationship building has meant to you in your career. And it's such a vital topic. I always say that relationship building is the essence of humanity. And I know that you are one of the elite relationship builders, and that's why I wanted to welcome you to my speaker series. And I know that the words of wisdom that you'll impart to my audience and me will be very much invaluable. You started as a sports writer and copy editor for the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. You were a judicial law clerk for the Honorable Bernard A. Friedman for the U.S. District Court in the Eastern District of Michigan. You were an associate for Butzel and Long, and then you became an assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, the United States Attorney's Office. You were also a U.S. attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice during President Obama's administration. And you're a legal analyst for MSNBC. And I look forward to, again, speaking with you today. Barbara, when you think of relationship building in a team environment, what does relationship building mean to you? And what has relationship building meant for your career?
Well, I think relationships are everything. I think that someone once said to me that success in life is not what you know or who you know, it's what others know about you. And the only way for people to know about your skill set and your talents and what you can bring to the table is if you've had a chance to demonstrate those things. And so that comes from building relationships. People aren't going to hire you just because they know you, because they want people who are going to do a good job, but you need to have an opportunity to demonstrate what you can do. And so one of the ways I think people can do that is, something that's commonly referred to as networking. But I don't think it's enough to just sort of glad hand and get to know people. I think you have to volunteer for things and take on leadership roles so that people can see you in those settings. So, earlier in my career, I joined the Federal Bar Association. That is a bar association in Detroit. And that was a chance for me to get to know other lawyers. But, there's lots of people who are members. To let people see what you're all about, you had to put some skin in the game and do some work. And so I joined some committees and I organized some programming and then ultimately worked my way up the leadership track to become president of that organization. And in the course of that, I worked with a lot of people. They saw my judgment, they saw my organizational skills, they saw me deal with challenges. And it helped me to develop a reputation outside of my workplace that I think helped serve me well when it came time for opportunities for advancement for me.
That's wonderful. And I love how you bring up networking. And there's an art to networking. It's certainly not a science. I believe that, and like you just said, I mean, to your point, it's not just glad handing. I mean, you really have to work it. You really have to understand that there's a lot of, human emotion and there is a lot of purpose behind it. And, there are people who love to be social, but there are also people who love to be purposeful in a social setting where they're trying to connect with others on multiple levels. And it depends on where you see the synergies and how you can collaborate with that individual, help their business, help them run an organization, be a part of the community, having a call to action where there are actionable steps that need to be taken to accomplish a goal or to allow a vision to take effect. So when you think about your career and how you started, and I would love to know, what in your mind was the deciding factors in attending the University of Michigan and going to the University of Michigan's law school. What or whom I should say were your mentors early on that helped shape the course of your career, and how much of that relationship building, what this podcast is about, relationship building and team environment, how much did relationship building matter in those very important decisions?
I think that most of my career choices tie back to my earliest memories of current events, which was Watergate. As a child, I remember watching the Watergate hearings and thinking that it was terrible that someone who was entrusted with so much power, the president of the United States, had done something wrong and resigned from office as a result of it. So I was quite riveted by the hearings. And it made me very interested in two career paths. One was law, but the other was journalism, because of course it was Woodward and Bernstein who had exposed some of this wrongdoing. So I kind of pursued both of those paths, but I had, wonderful mentors among teachers when I was in high school who encouraged me to get involved in writing and debating and leadership classes and other kinds of things. And so I did work as a sports writer, as you mentioned, for a year in Rochester, New York, but ultimately came back to law school and then was very fortunate to have some great mentors along the way. The judge you mentioned, Bernard Friedman, was a wonderful friend and mentor. He had been a prosecutor earlier in his career and was very fond of the work of the U.S. Attorney's Office. And then the U.S. Attorney who hired me, Saul Green, was a wonderful mentor and role model for me. So all of those people really shape who we become, what we care about, what we like, what we don't like. And so it's really important when you're the mentor to realize the impact you're having on others around you. I think when you're a young person, you look up to these people as if they're gods. Now that I'm, north of 60, I think of my role as a mentor much differently, but I think it's really important to remember that your words and your deeds are incredibly influential on younger people who are looking for role models and hoping to understand how the world works. I start every law school class with a lesson of things I wish I'd known when I was in law school and try to impart some of that wisdom that has been shared with me over the years. Because I think the role models I remember best are the ones who were very intentional about it, who were sharing advice, who were providing opportunities. And so I think those of us who are more senior in our careers owe it to others, even though we're, crazy busy and don't have a lot of free time. But really part of being a responsible professional, I think, is helping to develop younger professionals who are coming up behind you.
Yes, and you speak about how Watergate had such a profound impact on you. As many Americans across the country, my parents are from that generation that you are, who were younger, where for the first time in their recent memory, they see a president of the United States, Richard Nixon, who's leading our country, who represents us Americans not only on the domestic front but also abroad. And he has to resign in disgrace because of the events of Watergate. And so when you think of the Trump administration and both terms now, where the first term of 4 years and now we're going into the second year of his second administration, that so much unprecedented litigious nature of his administration and on full display, full spectacle for not only Americans who have to unfortunately be subjected to it on a daily basis, but what our allies and adversaries both think abroad. And when you're teaching at the University of Michigan, how has your teaching style changed? How have you had to apply it from the standpoint as these young aspiring attorneys or people who aspire to be judges or people who aspire to be prosecutors or part of the defense counsel, wherever their careers will take them right after their days at University of Michigan conclude? But how do you teach them that what we're seeing at the federal level is not really how one would have expected law students to have come up 20, 30, 40 years ago because of just the unprecedented nature that we're seeing in the White House today?
It's a tricky line because I don't ever want to engage in politics in class. And so I try to make it clear that, I don't care if your politics are left, right, center, or anywhere in between. Certainly, there are valid things that the Trump administration is doing. But what we have to look at as lawyers is how the administration is doing certain things, right? The rule of law is not about whose side is winning and what policy goals there are. It's really about making sure that things are done according to statutes and the Constitution. And so when we see things like the militarization of ICE on the streets of Minneapolis, I think there is an opportunity to talk with law students about certainly the federal government is in the business of enforcing immigration laws. And if they want to do so and make that a high priority, it's absolutely within the prerogative of the administration. But that does not allow agents and officers to use pepper spray against peaceful protesters. It also does not mean protesters can obstruct their work. And so helping students to understand where the line is drawn on those things, I think, is important. We've talked about the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy and what laws may or may not have been violated there, how those are typically investigated, and the kinds of options that are available for prosecutors on the very high bar that we have before an officer can be convicted of a crime. So I think putting those things in perspective for students is really important. I also think this concept of disaggregating is really important. And what I mean by that is, even if people are generally either opposed or in favor of some of the activities of the Trump administration, you should not be, all in or all out, right? You should look at things at an elemental level. That's what it means to think like a lawyer. And so, you may find that some of the activities that the Trump administration is engaged in are unpleasant or inappropriate, or you dislike them, but that doesn't make them illegal. And so, trying to think through what the statutes are, what the Constitution is, I think it actually provides us with a very good opportunity to be thinking critically about what's going on. Social media, I think, lends this idea of what's known to debaters as the either or fallacy. That is, there are only two choices of anything in this world. You're either for me or against me, and there's no gray area or nuance in between. And I think for lawyers, learning to appreciate the shades of gray and the nuance. And sometimes my team, to the extent I have one, is right. And sometimes it's wrong. And sometimes it's murky because we look at the law, not about who's winning or the outcome, but the process.
Sure. And with the video evidence that we've seen play out in the media with respect to the tragic murders of Alex Pretty and Renee Good, and because we live in the age where various video angles or how things are being portrayed and people are seeing with their own eyes, what actually occurred on camera, I know that, and to your point, any administration has every right, obviously within reason and following the law, because there's nothing greater than the rule of law, especially in our free democratic society, because that's the standard of law. The rule of law is what we have to adhere to. But when this administration is pushing back on even what observers or what people like you and me, you're a lawyer, I'm a non lawyer, but to your point, everybody should try to think like a lawyer, and I went to preparatory school. I went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So like University of Michigan, very much about the Socratic method, always asking questions, always eliciting responses, making you think critically, making you research, making you, dig deep with respect to fact finding. So when your students are looking at those videos and they're seeing whether it's Alex Pretty helping a woman up, who is violently pushed back or pushed down, or Renee Good, who's turning her vehicle away from a federal agent. But in both circumstances, she is shot dead. In Alex Pretty's situation, he's disarmed and he is not a threat to society at that point, but then he's killed thereafter. I know that there's a lot of context and you have to know and understand what events are leading up to those. I can understand that it's not about just single frames strung together and then you're trying to make sense of a 20 or 30-second video. But, with your legal mind, how do you compartmentalize and say, okay, it's not a matter of what we see, it's a matter of understanding everything in its totality and then trying to then backtrack and make sense of what we're actually saying. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been so disturbing is we have seen the administration make statements that are inconsistent with our own eyes can show us. They came out initially, and instead of what we have typically seen administrative officials say, things like, this is a tragedy, our hearts go out to the victims, there will be a fulsome investigation, it will be transparent, and we will hold accountable any wrongdoers. Instead, it was, a lot of phrases like, this was a domestic terrorist, or this was an anarchist attack. I think some agents association said that Alex Pretty brandished his gun. And when we look at this video, we see an attempted assassination. I think no such thing. And so I think that really undermines the credibility of the administration. If they're, lying to us about these things that we can see with our own eyes, what else are they lying about that we can't see? So we've talked about before, Garrett, it's really important that you have trust to have a good team and to be effective in law enforcement to have trust. Instead, we saw first there's not going to be any investigation of Renee Good's killing. In fact, there was reporting that they decided to investigate Renee Good and her wife themselves, which led to the resignation of a number of federal prosecutors in the Minneapolis office. So that certainly undermines credibility. And then with regard to Alex Pretty, at first it was said that there'd be no investigation. Then it was DHS was going to investigate. That's sort of the fox guarding the hen house, right? An agency investigating itself. And then now we've heard that FBI will investigate. I think it shows that public pressure can make a difference. There was an outcry about this. The first one was bad enough. The second one maybe is even worse. And we now have an agreement to at least investigate it as a crime. However, in light of the statements that have come out about this, it may be difficult for the public to accept whatever outcome they have. Imagine they come out and say, we've done a full investigation and we've concluded no crimes were committed. I don't know that this administration now has the credibility that maybe prior administrations had, where people may not like the outcome, but feel like, okay, they gave them a fair shake. The law for prosecuting police officers is very high, and in my opinion, appropriately so. The jury instructions say something like police officers have to make split-second decisions of life and death in rapidly evolving situations. And so it's not enough to show that they made a mistake or exercised poor judgment or had poor training. You have to show that they willfully, deliberately violated someone's constitutional rights. In other words, I knew it was wrong and I did it anyway. That's a very high standard. And so it's really important to look at all the camera angles from every angle, look at the ballistics reports, talk to everybody who was there, get all of the recordings that are available to find out what happened. You could see a scenario where someone yells gun, 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 and one of the agents thinks Alex Pretty has pulled a gun and fires. Or you could imagine a scenario where someone says, he's got a gun in his waistband, I've got it, and it's cleared. Those are two very different scenarios as to whether the shooting was willful. But I think that when you've got an administration rushing to judgment before there's been any investigation, saying there's no crime here, then any result they have at the end of their investigation, I think, is going to be suspect. And that's just a bad way to build public trust. I think you need to, in the initial stages, come out and, say the things we've traditionally said: empathy, acknowledge the tragedy, acknowledge the loss of life. And I think sometimes the instincts of this administration have been just the opposite.
Yes, and as an American citizen, how concerned are you about the erosion of public trust? And because it's the relationship building and team environment podcast, I mean, this is a lack of relationship building, I believe, in the highest magnitude. I mean, when you as a citizen and me as a citizen, I mean, we want to know that our country, that our fellow American citizens, or people who are here seeking asylum to come here to seek a better life, we want to know on the immigration front. We want to know about how the police at the state level, but our federal military officials, how they're interacting with American citizens and how we can bridge community members with law enforcement at local, state, and federal levels where that trust does not erode. And because it has, and because this administration is implementing policies, and to your point, yes, you want to focus on immigration, you want to focus on, it could be anything: healthcare policy, education policy, any type of an agenda that takes care of our citizens and puts us first, and that you have that empathy and you have that compassion coming from this administration. But when there is none, how could we feel good about these situations with Renee Good and Alex Pretty? How can we feel good that there will be a solution where the outcome, whatever the outcome is, and whatever the federal investigation leads to, knowing that really, even before the federal investigation concludes, we don't have trust that this administration is going to take it to the extent and to really do a nonpartisan job of really just focusing on the facts, so we don't feel that this could happen again. I mean, how do you, as a lawyer, someone in the legal community, how are you able to really look at it from the lens of, okay, I'm going to try to remove my emotion out of it and look at it from just a legal standpoint? How are we supposed to sustain what our country was founded on, which is the rule of law, adhering to it, and knowing that we have a Supreme Court who will also not be partisan? Because we have seen it up until this point that the president has presidential immunity to some extent, and there is a 6-3 majority with conservatives leading. And I think that from a congressional standpoint, even if the Democrats are able to take back the House and Senate, which looks very likely given President Trump's latest poll numbers or in recent months, that, are we going to just become a society where it's just back and forth? Democrats, well, we have congressional support. We're going to gain back seats in the midterms. But then President Trump's like, well, I have the Supreme Court that's conservative led. We don't want three co-equal branches of government to having to be positioning their agenda when it really should be three co-equal branches of government practicing great solid relationship building skills, so that helps the betterment of society.
Yeah, I'll say a couple things about that. It appears to me that through many of the actions of the Trump administration, the president has sought to expand executive power to its ultimate degree, really testing boundaries, asserting power, inviting lawsuits. If he wins, he's expanded his power. If he loses, then no harm done, taxpayer funds to defend the lawsuits. But I submit that that is an unpatriotic way to look at the executive branch. The framers of the Constitution, as you said, deliberately divided power among three separate and co-equal branches of government. And the reason they did that was because they wanted to avoid a monarch. We had just shed the governance of a monarchy, and we wanted a government of the people. We knew we needed a president to execute the laws, right? Somebody's got to be kind of the manager of running the government. And so we decided on a president. But making of the laws is entrusted to the most accountable part of our government, the legislature, and then interpreting the laws to a court that was designed to be independent, life terms for these judges and justices, so that once they were appointed, they could not be removed from office except for high crimes or misdemeanors through impeachment, so that if you just didn't like a decision, you couldn't remove them for that. And that was to insulate them from politics, so they could just decide cases according to the law. But what we're seeing now, I think, is a president who is working to usurp some of that power. We've seen a Congress that has been sort of an enabler in many ways, members of the president's own party who don't speak up when the president does things that seem clearly to violate the laws. Tariffs, the Constitution gives the power to levy taxes on Congress. Congress should be speaking up about that. That's gone to the court. We'll see what the Supreme Court has to say about that. The attack on Venezuela, it appears to be a violation of the UN Charter, which says we do not take aggressive actions against members of the United Nations unless we are acting defensively. I don't think anyone would, with a straight face, could say that we were in armed conflict with Venezuela before that, except for our own attacks on them. And by ratifying the UN Charter in 1945, Congress gave it the force of law, and under the Constitution, ratified treaties are the supreme law of the land. And so giving him a pass there. And every time you give somebody a pass, it allows him to accumulate more power, I think, to the detriment of the other branches and of the people. There's a great book called How Democracies Die. It's written by two political scientists at Harvard who talk about successful, thriving, long-lasting democracies have some features in common. And two of those are really important. One is tolerance, mutual tolerance. That is, we accept that there are other branches of government. We accept that there are other parties. In fact, we know that it's essential to have all of these different parties as part of our government to make it healthy. And we don't want all the power, because if we had all the power, that would be bad for our country. And so even though personally maybe the president wants all the power, a recognition that our country is better off when power is shared. Most presidents respect that. When Congress asks for documents, they provide it. When there are requests from one party or another, there's debate. Instead, we see attacks on other branches and other parties as to suggest that somehow these people hate our country because they don't go along with the Trump agenda. The other thing they mention in that book is forbearance. That is, just because the president can do something with his power doesn't mean he should. And so can the president go on the streets of Minnesota with agents armed as if they're in a, war zone? Yeah, I guess they can, but should they? What is that doing to the quality of life for the people of Minnesota? Can the president deport every non-US citizen, and instead of prioritizing those based on criminal records, just scoop up everybody standing outside of school? Yeah, he can, but should he? And so the can versus should question, I think, is one that when a president is bent on maximizing power and domination, does not lend itself to maintaining the quality of life that we have always known in America.
Yes, all valid points, Barbara. I appreciate that insight. And, from a polling perspective, when the polls have shown that even Trump's most fervent supporters have pushed back, whether it's the farmers in California or whether it's people who just across the country who don't like the fact that non-violent undocumented immigrants are the ones who are being deported when all they've ever tried to do is, yes, seek a better life. Yes, did they come across our border illegally? Yes, but also no. It depends on what the motive was. Our Constitution protects asylum seekers, and that's goes back to the Reagan administration, one of the most true conservative presidents we've had in modern history. And so, yes, our immigration system is broken, but you can look at every part of the federal government in every institution and say there definitely needs to be some repair. There has to be some type of looking through where could we improve, not a complete overhaul like what President Trump did with the Department of Education. I understand you want to, have education policy go back to the states, but you still need a federal government presence or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He was looking to dismantle. And I, unfortunately, as an Armenian American, was discriminated against because of being an Armenian American, and everything would happen with Citibank and how they had to pay a very steep penalty. And I look at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that my rights were protected and I was unknowingly discriminated against, and I received compensation from Citi, but I was one of the fortunate ones to receive compensation because the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau under President Biden obviously did the right thing to make sure that Armenian Americans were paid, but a lot of Armenian Americans still are waiting to receive compensation, but may very well not receive it because under the Trump administration, that litigation has gone away or that settlement is no more because the Trump administration was able to do away with it and now not hold Citibank accountable. So I just feel for anybody who has been in my situation or even in various other situations where their businesses have been affected, their ways of life have been affected, their freedoms have been affected. And you don't have to look any further than Alex Pretty and Renee Good and the countless people whose lives have been taken away for what? Because they're standing up for fellow citizens, because they're exercising their First Amendment rights. And did we ever think that somebody, especially someone who's exercising his Second Amendment rights, because conservatives and even the NRA had pushed back against the Trump administration, knowing that Alex Pretty was disarmed and then he was basically assassinated on the streets of Minneapolis. So it's so mind boggling and it's so hard to process all these different things that we're seeing. And at abroad, you make a great point about Venezuela. I mean, now that we've captured Maduro, but there was no way that oil companies were going to come in and start extracting or taking over Venezuelan oil when there is really no need for Venezuelan oil. We're not really seeing concrete steps there. We're not really seeing a fervor from these oil companies saying that they're all in on Venezuelan oil. And then the threat of the Trump administration using military force, although they've not really stated what their intentions were, but not taking military force off the table, and then obviously backtracking. But we were never going to invade Greenland. How could we invade a NATO partner? And then NATO warned us, NATO countries warned us that if we ever invaded Greenland, the entire establishment of NATO would not be back intact and we would be out of NATO essentially. So I just think this idea of the Monroe Doctrine that Trump is also trying to bring back up, but we're a global superpower. We always have been. The Monroe Doctrine that worked at a certain place at a certain time in infant stages of our country. So I just find it all concerning, but really I'm disturbed by what I see as an American citizen. And I can imagine, as someone who is a part of the legal community, as somebody who speaks about it on television, somebody who teaches her students about the rule of law, and just you look at all these different cases and in case precedents. But with this administration, we've heard it on TV all the time. The word unprecedented gets used a lot. So it is, to me, very heartbreaking what we've seen. And that's why I love having people like you, Barbara, come on, because you have that depth of knowledge that other non-lawyers, lay people don't have. And that's why I find your words of wisdom to be very appropriate, very timely, and very appreciative at this point.
Yeah, well, thank you. I would just say in response to what you just said, we've always been a nation of laws. When we have differences, no doubt, we will continue to have differences of opinion on policy choices. But the way we resolve our differences is in courts of law and at the ballot box, and not through, arresting our political rivals or calling the press the enemy of the people or even acting beyond the scope of a president's power, right? We started the conversation by talking about how Richard Nixon was removed from office for abusing his power. What he did and his resignation almost seem quaint and noble by today's standards when we think about some of the things that you just mentioned with regard to President Trump. But, this idea like dismantling the Department of Education or the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, those agencies were created by Congress, and only Congress can decide we don't want those anymore. We want to put education in the states, or we think that these regulations are hampering big business. We can make those decisions, but it's Congress who gets to decide whether to eliminate those things, not the president. And I think one of the things the president is doing is daring others to challenge him. And in some instances, there have been challenges in court. But in other instances, I think he has tried to silence his critics by coming down so hard on them. Law firms and the media and universities have learned that if they cross the president, he will reverse himself as a counterpuncher. He will punch back times 10. And, as the president has the power, perhaps not the lawful authority, but the power to take away grant funding and take away access to federal buildings and other things. I think most of those entities that have filed lawsuits to challenge some of those executive orders punishing them in advance have been successful, but there are others who don't even want to fight the fight, just like, here, I'm just going to pay you some money and please leave me alone. But of course, when that happens, it just feeds the beast and I think hurts the rest of us.
And what do you believe this country needs to get back to from a relationship building standpoint, from a trust standpoint? What do we need to get back to a better place? Again, highlighting separate, co-equal branches of government. And that part separate is now blurred, and it's been blurred for, more than 2 decades. I mean, it's not even the 1990s where Republicans and Democrats could get along and still both feel that they have a seat at the table and both sides could be heard, and that they can come to the table and then common ground could be reached, and that great policy can be implemented and legislation can be passed where the president signs, goes into law, and help the American people. And I know that government doesn't always get it right, and I know that people are not perfect, but when you're already dealing with somebody who maybe he's not healthy himself, with the reports that we hear about in terms of his health, but just mentally, he's not what the founders envisioned in terms of someone being our sitting president or someone who aspired and won 2 elections, someone who operates like a king. And so, what do you hope we have to do as a country, and what reforms do we have to hope for in Congress where we don't have another Donald Trump in the White House in the future? And I'm not saying it to just focus on Donald Trump, but it took 250 years to find somebody who, to your point, makes the Richard Nixon years to be not even on the Richter scale of offensive or catastrophic, although Watergate was pretty catastrophic for its time and how that all played out. But we're seeing things where there's no due process. There's no due process for the people who are in boats in the Pacific or in the Caribbean who are being taken out by military force. And, there are survivors and they're being killed too on boats. And it's one of those things where if we lose due process, Barbara, and due process very well, because you teach it in law school at the University of Michigan. If we lose due process, then that's a very serious, serious thing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that President Trump has done so successfully is to convince the public that the nuance, the laws, the details, the procedures, none of that matters. All that matters is whether your team is winning. And he has divided the world into two teams. There's us and there's them. And my team, Donald Trump's team, he has framed it as the party of law and order, of religion, of tradition, of real America. And anybody who doesn't agree with him is on the other team. They are elites. They are the enemies of the people. They are animals and all these horrible things he calls people who are immigrants to our country. That's not who we are. And I think what we need to do is remind people that our Constitution is all about process. It is all about honoring our fundamental rights, like our right to free speech, our right to due process, our right to bear arms. All of these things are fundamental individual rights. And I think that oftentimes when people care more about winning and their team, then they allow the ends to justify the means. And I think that is what President Trump has convinced an alarming number of people matters more than process. And I think we can get back again, but we need people to stand up and say, I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat. I don't care what your policy preferences are. What matters most is the process of honoring the laws and the constitutions of this country. Because if you're willing to shove those things aside in favor of your side, what happens when the other side is in power? You might like it when your guy, your team is winning, but are you going to like it when the other team is in charge? And if the answer is no, then, we need to get back to this idea that we are a nation of laws and not of men.
Yes, nation of laws and not of men is a great way to conclude our interview. I want to thank you so much. Again, you're referencing Gerald R. Ford, so I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Barbara, for being with me today on the Wave Capital's guest speaker series on relationship building and the team environment. My 101st guest. Really enjoyed our time today. And I look forward to having many more conversations in the future. And I know that there's a lot going on today in our country, in our world. And I just hope and pray for better days ahead.
Thanks, Garrett.
Take care. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Same to you.